There is a frustration at the center of existence. There is a frustration at the center of being a human. That, dogs, they don't sit there and wonder, what am I here for? Cows, they don't sit there and go, what is the purpose of all this? And cats, they don't have souls. They're just, they just scratch you. That's all they do. They're like, more food and I will scratch you. Thank you. But that's just, but there's a frustration. The fact that we humans, we actually sit there and we can go out into the sky unprovoked by anyone else telling us what to do, and we're going to go, why? Like, it's weird, And we kind of sit there and we kind of go, okay, what is out there? What is this whole thing for? Is there anything more than this? There's this sort of frustration kind of built into what it means to be human. And what's interesting about human beings is throughout the human history, the vast majority of humans who did go outside and look at the starry skies above it, and they go, why? They would typically, almost all of them, would answer the question, because God, I guess. I mean, if you could go through the list of world religions that have existed throughout history, and we can't really go through a list because it's kind of a hard thing to Google. Like if you say, hey, what's the list of history, religions of the world? Like, you got to narrow it down somehow, dude. You can't, because there's just so many of them that people have so often come to the answer saying, there's got to be a God. None of this makes sense without a God. It doesn't make sense down here without. It doesn't make sense that nothing would just come from something would just come from nothing. It doesn't make sense that there would not be some sort of creature up there who made it all happen. A couple of weeks ago, a video came across my feed, and I watched it. It was about developments in the scientific world. And it was a Catholic priest talking, and he started off talking about the scientists themselves. And he said, inside the scientific world, with a poll of scientists today, 51% of all scientists are believers in a God or a higher power, which is different than I would have predicted, than what I was told and what I often thought about the scientific community. And he then said, of scientists who are 40 years and younger, if you narrow it down, 40 years and younger, it's 61% people who say, I believe in God or some higher power. That even in the scientific community, they're coming back with this idea going, man, it doesn't make sense without a God. It doesn't make sense without some sort of statement like, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, if you get that sentence, it kind of helps with a lot of other things. And at this point, you might be going, wait, time out, Garrett. Then what's the frustration? I'm a pastor after all. Shouldn't I be more than a little excited about the fact that it doesn't make sense without there being some sort of God making it all happen? And the answer is, yes, I am kind of happy about that. Because it doesn't make sense for there just to not be a God. None of this that we have or see or any of that stuff makes sense without God being a part of the equation. But if God does exist, where is He? Why does it feel like He sits around so much? Why does it seem like He leaves us hanging? Why doesn't He talk to us? If He did do something, how do we know it? If it was Him making something happen around us, how would we recognize it? It's these two things crash into each other. And it creates quite a frustration at the center of everything, of existence, of what it means to be human. I mean, over the last 50, 100 years, atheists have had a heyday that they've never had before in the history of the world. And it's the second question that is the reason why. Where they can just sit around and say, well, what about all the wars? And what about all the hardship? And what about all the tsunamis? What about all the things? And you kind of go, okay, what's happening here? On the one hand, it doesn't make sense for there not to be a God who didn't make something happen. On the other hand, where is He? And this frustration is actually perfectly summarized by our verse out of the Bible today. This is one of the first times, I don't do this very often. I came to stage without a Bible. I don't have my Bible up here because we have one verse. That's it. That's just one verse. And our verse today says, no one has ever seen God. That's the frustration, isn't it? The frustration is that no one's ever seen God. And I don't think you thought the Bible was going to say that, did you? That's not something you say like, hey, what's the Bible go around telling people that no one's ever seen God? Well, they did today. It told us that. And it doesn't make sense without him, but nobody's seen him. No one's making these sightings. We keep hearing rumors. We keep seeing inexplicable things. We keep hearing from prophets and wise men and even witch doctors. And some of them are compelling and some of them make sense. And some of them are even helpful if you can find it within yourself to follow their advice. But no one's making these sightings. Nothing's happening. C.S. Lewis says, the babies are born. They're born longing for milk. They want it. They don't know what it is. They don't know where to find it. They wouldn't be able to tell you what it is they're looking for, but they're born longing for milk. And here's what's so fascinating about that longing they are born with. One, it exists. The thing they're looking for exists. And two, it will satisfy their longing. Ducks are born wanting to swim. They want to get out there and swim on water. And guess what exists out there? Water for them to swim in. And then he says this about being human, about the frustrations that we have to live with. This is a direct quote. He says, if I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for a different world. What he's saying is humans aren't really born with longings and desires for things that just don't exist. You were born longing for food, and food exists for you to eat. You were born longing for water, and water exists for you to drink. And yet we still have this sort of need and this longing and this thing that sits us here going, it doesn't make sense without God. And yet no one's seen God. And the question is, how do we span that gap? How do we get from here to there? And this is one of those places where Christianity says, I have something to offer you. This is one of those places where Christianity plants its stake in the ground and says, I have something the rest of the world cannot offer and won't offer. And we have a lot of these things, by the way. A lot of people like to say all religions are basically the same. They're all basically going to the same place. No, this is one of those places, and we have several places where Christianity is just different than the rest of the religions. We have grace, and we have adoption into the family of God, and we have the resurrection, and this is one of them, where it says, you can know God. That He is there, and He is real, and He has made Himself known to you. That you can know God. And John comes around and he says, I know this is a frustration for all of us, because no one's ever seen God. But I've got news for you. The one and only Son, who is Himself God, and is in closest relationship with the Father, has made Him known. There's a God out somewhere out there, and Jesus has made Him known to us. This is what is one of those great benefits of the incarnation or of Christmas, the day where God became a man, where He could make God known to us. And we've been saying through this series is that when Jesus came, He brought stuff with Him. And that what He brought with Him today is the ability to know God. That's what we're going to talk about. And you may think that that's not actually the biggest achievement in the world. Wouldn't all religions say that we are here to make God known to you, that where you could know God? And wouldn't they all be saying the same thing just a little differently? And the answer is actually no. That's not the case. The normal religious view of God is that God's far away. There are no views that God is close by. There are no views that God has come near to be in the middle of everything with us. Here, Tim Keller was a pastor in New York City, and he's recently gone to be with the Lord. He died this last year. But he wrote a book called Hidden Christmas, and he was in New York City, which meant he interacted with people of all different, from all over the world, from different religions, all sorts of things. And he says this, he said, I had a bunch of marvelous, wonderful conversations with religious leaders of different religions throughout my life. And he says, what he loved about it was he could get it from their own mouth. I want you to tell me, what is your faith system's understanding of an individual's relationship to God? That's what he liked to ask them. And he said this, in general, these are the answers I received. Eastern religions do not grant the possibility of personal communion. God is in the end an impersonal force, and you can merge with that force, but you cannot have a personal communication with it. For other world faiths, God is personal, meaning He's a being with desires and a mind and ideas. It's kind of like what we think of as God. For other world faiths, God is personal, but He's too far removed to be said to have intimate, loving communion with believers. I have become convinced that what makes the difference for Christianity is the incarnation. No other faith says God became flesh. And what he's saying there is that Christianity comes and offers something that no one else does and no one else can. That God came near. And not only do other religions not offer it, but they don't try. And then John comes along in a world filled with religions, all saying he's kind of in the temple there, or he's on the mountain, or he's in the sky, or he's over here, or he's just kind of the grass, he's kind of everything. And then he comes along and says, no one's ever seen God. But the Son, who is himself God and is in the closest relationship with the Father, has made him known. Now, you're going to be annoyed by this, but I want to focus on that comma right there. You ever been there where you're like, I'm just over the moon about this comma right now? You know what I mean? No? You're not? Okay. Billionaires love commas, by the way. They can't get enough of them. They're like, keep putting more commas on my paycheck, guys. I'm okay with it. But do you see how this verse is written? It says, no one has ever seen God, comma, right there. What he's saying is that but that he's coming here is not in reference to the group, no one. It's in reference to the entire little clause right there, the entire little group. It says, no one has ever seen God, but... So he's saying, this is the problem, no one's ever seen God. Solution, but the Son has made him known. This is the most simple way of putting this sentence right here. It's the most simple way to break it down. Is here. Here's the direct thing he's saying here. You got a problem, but God, the Son, has made him known. And John is saying, guys, for all of human history, we've had a great big problem on our hands, a huge frustration. But we've been lost at sea, drifting here and there. But we have been seemingly left to our own devices. But, and this verse is at this point where Jesus Christ brings us hope. That when Jesus came into the room, he brought hope with him. Because he answered problems that never could be answered before. When this series was put on the calendar, I went on a preaching retreat with some other pastors, buddies of mine, and we kind of put ideas out there and we put them on the calendar. And as a church, we've kind of been hopping on and off of that calendar. And when I walked in the room, this series was already there. It's already called Arrival. It's already called John 1. It's already whatever. And these 4 words that we've been doing this week, life, glory, grace, and hope, were already on the calendar. They were just sitting there. They said, these were going to be our 4 verses. And so when the time came in early November and over my Thanksgiving break for me to start studying for these sermons, I came to realize that of the 3 words that we've chosen, hope is the only one that is not anywhere in John 1 through 1 through 18. It makes no appearances, okay? He says life, he says grace, he says glory, he does not say hope. And I started asking myself, How am I going? What is the one where I'm going to say here, okay, this is the thing for hope. This is what we're going to talk about. And I got to this verse at the very end, and I thought, this is it. This verse right here addresses our lives directly at the level of hope. Because we live in a world that leaves us hanging sometimes, doesn't it? We live in a world that leaves us asking, is that all there is? We live in a world where we can just sit there and we can kind of talk about it and go, well, it doesn't really make sense without God. But when we are living our lives and doing this, we kind of get left going, is that it? Is that all that's left for us? And the world promises us great things, and at the end of it, leaves us going, there's got to be more. There's got to be more than that. King Solomon actually did this experiment. He's like, I'm going to give it a go. I'm going to try. And I like to call King Solomon the first modern man. He was the first person that had the time, money, and the ability to just say, I'm going to see what there is out there, and I'm going to see if it'll satisfy me. It's called the Book of Ecclesiastes. And he went out and he chased after things. He said, I'm going to find it. I'm going to find satisfaction in this life if it's the last thing I do. And he went after women, and he went after success, he went after money, he went after great endeavors like architecture and breeding animals and all sorts of things. And yet he constantly came back to this refrain throughout the book, meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher. Utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless. And you're going, well, Garrett, stop, time out. Garrett, that's the Bible. Of course the Bible is going to tell you that. That's just the Bible preaching at us again. What about some, person who doesn't have an ulterior motive? What about a person who just cares about other people, is not trying to get me to follow a God? He's just going to tell me how it is and give me good advice. And I would say, well, okay, assuming such a person exists, let's go for that. Let's try to find what the world will tell us about chasing after our dreams. And that history tells us that at the end of, at some point, at the end of Alexander the Great's career, he fell to his knees and he wept because there was no more land for him to conquer. He built the Greek Empire to what he could consider the entire world as far as he could tell. And at the end of it, did he go, hey guys, let's go back home and enjoy our accomplishments because we're well-adjusted people? No. He goes, wait, that's it? There's got to be more. There's got to be more. Tom Brady had an infamous interview back when I was probably in middle school at this time, high school. He had only won 3 Super Bowls at this time, which we would later find out was a very small number for him. And he had that interview where he's sitting there going, I have 3 Super Bowl victories. And here's what he said. Here's a direct quote. There's times when I'm not the person I want to be. Why do I have these 3 Super Bowls and still think there's something greater out there for me? I mean, maybe a lot of people would just say, hey man, this is what it is. I've reached my goal, my dream, my life. Me, I think, God, it's got to be more than this. I mean, this can't be all it's cracked up to be. I'm 27. What else is there for me? There's got to be more. I once heard of a journalist who used to know some of these people who became rich and famous and celebrities and just world, appreciated people back before they were famous. And she said, and she came to this conclusion. She said, sometimes I like to think that if God wants to play a particularly cruel or nasty joke on somebody, he up and gives them everything they could ever want. He gives them the desires of their hearts. And she used to know people like Sylvester Stallone and Bruce Willis back when they were just doormen and bodyguards back in the day. And what she said was, back then, these people were perfectly wonderful people. They were nice to be around. And then one day they got the success, and they got the fame, and they got the money, and they got the movies, and they got everything they ever wanted, and it crushed them. It ruined them as people. Why? She said, because the next day they woke up and were still them. There's got to be more. A couple years ago, Demi Lovato wrote a song where she said, I feel stupid when I sing because nobody's listening. How can you be Demi Lovato and sit there and think seriously that no one's listening when you sing? How can you, she sells out arenas. Like, how can she think that? Because this world leaves you hanging. It leaves you going, there's got to be more. And so John comes and says, I have hope for people living in a world that constantly leaves you hanging. No one's ever seen God, but the Son has made him known. That curse is no longer there. You can know God. And John swears by this. He says the reason we have hope at Christmas is because Christmas literally, physically, actually, historically happened. That's the contention of Christianity, is that it either truly happened or it didn't. It either truly came and offered hope or it did not offer hope at all. That's the Christian assertion. And if we look at 1 John, John wrote the gospel that we've been looking at this whole time. Then he wrote 3 more letters, and he also wrote Revelation. But his 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, they're all written by the same John. And not John the Baptist. It's a different guy in the gospel. It's just that I know it's a little confusing. And John wrote 1 John, and this is what he says. That which was from the beginning, this is the very beginning of his letter, which we heard, and which we've seen with our eyes, and what we looked at, and we touched. This we proclaim concerning the word of life. We proclaim to you that we have seen and heard, so that you may have fellowship with us. Fellowship. And our fellowship is with the Father and His Son, Jesus Christ. Fellowship. Fellowship this way. Fellowship this way. Knowing each other. Knowing God. We write this to make our joy complete. Now, what is it that John says the fellowship with God comes from? From the fact that they heard Him with their own ears, that they could see Him with their own eyes, and they touched Him with their own hands, that He was actually here on earth. And He says, this is my testimony to you. And now John, when he's saying, I've heard with my ears, and I've seen with my eyes, and I've touched with my hands, he's not just waxing eloquent there. He's not just saying, how can I say this in a way where it's interesting? Although it is kind of interesting. I kind of liked it. But Robert Yarborough, who's a commentator, says he's actually using courtroom language. He's using the kind of words you would use when you're giving a testimony in court. It'd be like if John came out today and said, hey, I'm giving you the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. He was here. And He's given us fellowship with God. And He's giving you fellowship with us. And we can have a fellowship as a church and people with God and the back and forth, the whole thing. Because it literally, actually happened. God gives us hope. And there's one final thing I just want to say here. There's one verse we've read every single week. 2 really, I guess. In the beginning was the Word. And the Word was with God. The Word was God. And the Word became flesh and made His dwelling among us. That's verse 14. And that Word has made God known. This is the whole 18 verses in a nutshell. Here's the progression of where it's all going. And here's the final piece of hope I want to leave you with. How Jesus answers this in a way that's not just abstractions. It's not just another truth. It's not just another version of religion. It's not just another version of God or another version of His teachings, but it's something utterly different, utterly new that the world had never seen before. And here it is. It's this question. I have a question. Why is it that this entire time John has been talking about the Word? Wouldn't it make just as much sense to say, in the beginning was Jesus, and Jesus was with God, and that Jesus was God, and Jesus became flesh and made his dwelling among us? The reason is because when John said, "In the beginning was the Word," he used a word that was completely and utterly loaded. There is all kinds of surrounding significance to that word. In Greek, it's the word logos. In the beginning was the Logos. And that word meant something to everybody. The Jews would hear it and they would say, in the beginning was the Word that kind of just spoke things into being. It was the power of God that could create everything out of nothing. It could just say, let there be light, and there was. And just say, let there be a sea, and there was. And let there be a division between the sea and the land, and there was divided. And the night and the day was divided. And it was the power of God that could just speak things into being. And he's going, in the beginning was that power, that might, that activity that could just create things and make things happen. But the Greeks had an understanding of the word logos. They argued and debated for years. You know, the Greeks loved philosophy and that whole thing. They're going to figure out the whole world, and philosophy is going to do it for us. And they started arguing and debating about what is all this world here for? What's the meaning of it all? And what's the purpose? And what's the whole thing? And they came to come up with a shorthand for saying the whole topic. And they came to start asking, what is the logos? Meaning, like, what's the logic behind all of this stuff? Basically, what they're arguing was, what's the meaning of life? What's the meaning of life? When they'd say, what's the logos? They were asking, what's the meaning of life? What logic is there for us? And John comes around and he says something no one had ever considered before. He says, the meaning of life is a person. It's not a success level. It's not a class you can get into. It's not a trajectory to live your life in. The meaning of life is a person. Excuse me. And to the Greeks he said, and to the Jews he said, the power of God that can just create things out of nothing was not just a force, but it was a person. And that person, the meaning of life, became flesh. The power of God became flesh. And he dwelt among us. And with all his power, and with all his might, and with all the wisdom and all the significance that went into the man Jesus Christ, he still lived among us. And he still walked the hill of Calvary. And he let sinful, puny, insignificant, crummy little people like us nail him to a tree. We found the meaning of life and we killed him. We have the meaning of life and we run from him as fast as we can. But for some of us, for all of us, he still sits there and he says, if you come to me, if you will stop running, if you will stop fighting every step of the way, I can make you have fellowship with God. And through Jesus Christ, he has made God known. What a beautiful day Christmas is. And that day is tomorrow. I hope it will be beautiful. I hope you're with your family. I hope you have some sort of food you really like. And I hope you don't forget exactly what Jesus has given us and the hope that he has brought with his coming to this earth.